This show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Hello and welcome to the Thinking Tree Talk Show. I'm Kratika. And currently behavioral economics is much in demand, but not many people are aware of its importance and application. So today we have Mr. Kiriti Kanjilal, who is an assistant professor at Indraprasth Institute of Information Technology. So, sir, we have a very important discussion ahead of us. Recently, there was a Nobel Prize awarded last year in behavioral economics, and it was started by Daniel Kahneman's research, who was a psychologist who got awarded Nobel Prize in economics, and that is where this discipline gained much traction. But not many people know about its importance, and not many people know about its application. So, what is behavioral economics?
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for having me, and it's great to be on here. And I'm pretty thrilled to talk about behavioral economics, or for that matter, its applications. And let me sort of give both a general answer and then maybe an answer that people who have studied a little bit of economics will also be able to relate to. So the basic idea of behavioral economics, step back, first of all, what is it we do in economics, right? And one of the things amongst many things that we do is we kind of try to explain how people make choices or decisions under particular settings, of course. And the typical sort of format we follow, at least in the typical neoclassical economics that we study in the classroom, is that we try to choose a certain set of, say, quantities of goods, given we have some utilities for these goods, etc., etc., and there are some constraints, right? So constraints are of various types. The first constraint you study and the most obvious is income constraint, but there are other types of constraints like, for example, information constraints or future uncertainties, right? Future uncertainty is a type of information constraint, but a bit different because it's not that we don't know what's some information, we just don't know what's going to happen in the future. So, in these settings, traditional economics or neoclassical economics has some explanations for how people make what we call optimal choices, right? Now, behavioral economics, first of all, in no way rejects any of this. But what it does say is that, hey, we can actually, first of all, explain, and secondly, maybe even predict how people make choices in an even more accurate way. So, what does it kind of do about this? Is it says that yes, it's true that individuals or human beings or whatever it is are optimizing under some conditions. But it is also true that there are some psychological factors at play. And to sort of give a quick answer, these psychological factors can be broadly divided into like 3 to 4 things, right? One of them is cognitive factors. So a lot of the early behavioral economists are actually cognitive scientists. So like Herbert Simon, and even for that matter, Daniel Kahneman himself has a lot of his work is about the cognitive ability of a person to make a decision. So, here things that matter are things like, okay, it's great to have a utility function, but what is your starting point? Are you starting with 100 rupees, or are you starting with a lakh? Are you starting with a crore? Depending on your starting point, you are more likely to feel differently about losing the same amount of money and gaining the same amount of money, right? So this is what Daniel Kahneman calls loss aversion, or in general, what the literature calls loss aversion. In addition, of course, you will find that, I mean, he talks about the fact that we tend to give sort of disproportionate probabilities to specific events, right? Like events that we may feel strongly about or that we are emotionally connected to. Whereas the actual probability distribution, though in principle we may be aware of it, but we don't really treat it accordingly, right? So these are kind of cognitive factors. They're psychological factors that, we have the information, we have the ability, we have the desire to do something, but cognitively we are biased in some way or the other. At times, maybe even we don't bother to make that, for example, if I offer somebody a cake and say, hey, take some of this cake, maybe the optimal choice would be like 17 by 25 parts of this cake, but a person will just go with half or one piece or a quarter, right? Some heuristic, some approximations, right? So in terms of optimizing, in terms of the ability to cognitively, or rather in terms of your cognitive ability to kind of make a perfect decision, People are not always there. And secondly, there are some other factors, as I said, like your reference, your frame dependence, how much money are you starting with? Or for example, are you the sort who really values gain more or loss more? And typically Kahneman would say that people hate losing 100 rupees more than they like gaining 100 rupees, right? So
Yeah.
we have these sort of utility functions that have different shapes and stuff like that because of this. So this is one factor. One is cognitive factors, but there are a few other factors. There's emotional factors. For example, traditional economic theory would probably say, okay, do you really want to share anything? I mean, you keep everything to yourself, right? But in reality, we know that if we have a choice between, say, me getting completely full and my friend going hungry versus both of us being like 50% full, I might like to share my food with that person. So those are what you can call, emotional factors. There are also social factors. We are social beings, right? A lot of our choices are not completely our choices, right? So say for example we might wear certain types of clothes that we find very uncomfortable, but maybe they are fashionable, or we might eat certain food that is fashionable but or that everybody at the table is eating, but we might not like it. I can give you a very simple example of this. Imagine that people are going for, say, a wedding tomorrow, and you have decided to kind of buy a suit, right? So at that point, you're saying, okay, I'm going to wear this suit to the wedding tomorrow. So I have a high willingness to pay for this suit, right? But then it turns out like maybe your friends message and say, hey, we are all wearing kurta pajama, and we are going to take a photo. So would you like, would like you to wear the same thing? Now that is a very good example of how your preferences will completely alter just overnight.
So that really explains what is behavioral economics from an economist's perspective, or probably for students of economics. But in general, for a person who's not very good at economics, or probably doesn't know economics very well, how can we use behavioral economics to make everyday life better?
So that's kind of an interesting question because, as I said, the ones who really use behavioral economics are actually not the agents who are behaving, but some firms and some government and some policymaker. But what what is often a result of behavioral economics is that people end up making decisions because they are behaviorally biased, but they end up regretting it. And this is kind of a place in which one can be conscious of their behavioral biases, and perhaps they can make better decisions. So let me sort of give you a few examples in day-to-day life, right? So there is this concept called what do you say is known as effective forecasting, right? So what is effective forecasting? It is the idea that you sort of when you are making a decision today, you are sort of forecasting something about the future, and then you are kind of trying to make a decision today. Now here you will find that there are a lot of times where we make mistakes, right? And there are a series of these things happening. But I can give some very simple examples. So I'll give the example of this thing called projection bias. So what is projection bias? Projection bias is essentially that given the situation that we are in, may be affected by some external factors, we tend to sort of make these tend to sort of make mistakes about what our future preferences will be. So a very common example given by economists and psychologists are, you should never go to the grocery store, or maybe in today's world you should never shop online when you are hungry, because
Yeah.
when you are hungry you are likely to buy all sorts of rubbish, and then you're going to go home and you're going to really regret it. So and this is known as what you call projection bias. Another really important bias that one should be conscious of is this thing called present bias. So in general, there is this idea that there is this thing. It's called time discounting, where we as individuals value things that are closer to us in terms of time, like so closer to us as in today, tomorrow, day after, more than things that are far in the future.
Hmm.
Now, this has some rational logic to it as well, because if you get money today, you can invest it in a bank or in a stock rather than getting it 10 days later. But the extent of our bias is often quite exaggerated. And the typical sort of term for this is hyperbolic discounting. That is, we kind of value today more than tomorrow and tomorrow more than day after, etc. But there is also another element to it, and that is we often just in a binary sort of way, value the present more than anything tomorrow. So that is known as present bias. That is, kal kar lenge basically. So kind of put together these two, the mathematical expression for this is quasi hyperbolic discounting, which is like A, we value something closer to us in terms of time more than something further away, and B, we value today more than tomorrow. But often this kind of decision, this kind of way of making decisions can lead to regret, because tomorrow you're like, oh no, I should have done it yesterday. So basically, in general, I mean, you will know that there are so many biases. I mean, you can talk about even a couple of others, but there are so many of these biases where we can kind of be a little conscious of them and make decisions accordingly, so that we don't make mistakes in a future time. So I can give you another really important, interesting example. It's known as the gambler's fallacy. So the gambler's fallacy is the idea that, say, you roll a dice and you've rolled it 5 times and you've gotten like one every time. So in your mind, you're thinking, you know what, I've gotten one like 5 times in a row. I'm definitely not getting one a sixth time. Like, it's not going to happen. But the reality is that because every roll of a dice is what we call IID, right, or independently and identically distributed, just because you have rolled one 5 times does not mean that the probability on the
Cannot
sixth,
come the sixth time.
it's just 1/6. It's the same, right?
Yeah.
So this is known as the gambler's fallacy, and even though I'm assuming that not many of the viewers gamble, but a very good sort of implementation of this, and there's a wonderful paper on this, is known as the hot hand fallacy, where basically it's a research on this basketball game, essentially, where they kind of, there is a sense in sports that if we take a couple of shots and they go in the basket or in the goal or whatever, that we have a higher probability of hitting the third shot. It's kind of these streaks or being in form or whatever it is, right? But the reality is that there's no such evidence for this whatsoever. But we tend to get carried away, right? Because we think that, like our just a small sample affects our expectations on the next sort of shot or whatever it is. So if you're playing sports, just because you are lucky doesn't mean you should do it again. So like that's kind of, these are some very interesting things which if you read up on these things, and there's a lot of work on these kind of concepts. So for those who actually read seriously, by guys like Odong, Rabin, Lowenstein, Tversky, these, of course, stalwart economist Kahneman himself. And absolutely, must look into these. And you'll be really interested to know how they've explained so nicely how we make our decisions badly sometimes. So this is a
Definitely.
simple
I
answer
think
day to day. Yeah.
I think that, of course, knowing these concepts definitely will help in the daily life. Of course, if I had known that going empty stomach would increase my grocery bill to this much, I would never have done that. So that's a good thing to know. I also have been reading Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, and he also explains this very well in his book. Um, about how our decisions that we make instantly, our intuition is not actually intuition, but we've learned it over time that, okay, a woman who's looking angry is probably not going to say very nice words to you. So that's a very interesting concept for our viewers if you want to go through it. So moving on to our next question. Considering the recent trend of associating every discipline to human emotions as a better marketing technique, do you think behavioral economics will outgrow traditional economics?
Outgrow, no. Short answer is no. Behavioral economics, by the way, I mean, most behavioral economists, I should say, and most of the work in behavioral economics is very much within the realm of traditional economics, right? So let me give you one really common example, and this is probably a little more for those who study economics a bit more seriously. Like, one of the things that you do in economics 101, but also moving forward, is you first define what an individual's preferences over goods and services, or over a bundle of commodities, and you kind of place some assumptions on them, that they are complete, that they are transitive, and if they are both complete and transitive, they are rational, etc., etc. And then you sort of say that, okay, I am now going to make a utility function that maps these preferences to that function and correctly represents the ordinality, that is the ordering of these preferences. And of course, utility functions also have a cardinality, that is, there is a number associated with the utility I am getting from consuming these goods. Now, so I can actually even suggest a really nice piece by very famous economist Bertrand Kozegi. It's a Journal of Economics literature paper which basically summarizes the work essentially, and it's called Behavioral Contract Theory. It's kind of a longish paper with a series of references, and anyone looking to do behavioral economics must read this because it's behavioral economics in contract theory specifically, but wonderful work. And there you will see something really interesting, right? I mean, if you look at that, or in general, when he's talking about how people have incorporated things like what do you say, altruism, inequity aversion, or even reciprocity, etc., overconfidence, into their into how people make decisions, they simply do it by modifying utility functions. They simply say that, hey, I get some utility from consuming a good, but I also get some utility from my friend consuming a good. And that is basically kind of adjusting the mapping of preferences to a utility function. Now, this in itself is nothing that traditional theory has a problem with in any way. So essentially, I mean, behavioral economics to a large extent grows within the existing theory and tries to just increase its explanatory and predictive power, I would say. And also, you could add to that that it kind of brings in a lot from other fields because it's able to sort of I mean, you could say that traditional economic theory assumed away some of these things, but behavioral economics says that even if we don't assume it away, we don't need to completely change the framework or anything. So, I mean, behavioral economics has grown wonderfully within traditional theory. I mean, let me give you an example. You know, there's this paper, American Economic Review paper in 2009, I think, by Raj Chetty, Looney and Croft. Raj Chetty, of course, very famous Indian origin economist, but he has worked on this paper where um, he essentially shows that, you know, like they do this experiment in the grocery shop where some goods are shown with their full price, that is with taxes, and some goods are shown without taxes, but they're shown and taxes whatever. I mean, you know that there are going to be some taxes added, whereas in some cases it is explicitly given in the price, and it shows that, when you sort of explicitly state the price because people see a higher price, they end up sort of purchasing less of the good, even though the price is actually the same. And even though they know the rate of tax and everything. And, and this is, very important for both the shop owners or, you can say the grocery store owner because they want to sell more. And this is also important for policymakers because if, for example, they want to reduce the sales of something like alcohol, they might want to include that, that high price. So people know, hey, this is really expensive versus you go to the checkout counter and then find it's expensive. So this is a very good example of, okay, it's behavioral economics in a way, but it's very much within the conventional way of doing things, right? And similarly, I mean, you will find a lot of literature that uses the idea that people are behaviorally biased, etc., not in any way completely rejecting traditional theory. And I think there is a bit of a misconception over there as well. But yeah, I mean, it has grown wonderfully within the subject, and I think they've grown very nicely together, which is why you even find a lot of conventional economists very openly embracing the idea that, behavioral economics is important to sort of further take economics further, both theoretically and empirically. That's kind of my answer to that question.
So, given the prominence of big data, since it has taken over everything today, without big data, I don't think majority of things can't function today. So, given the prominence of big data, which approach do you think is more relevant today? Experimental economics or behavioral?
I mean, experimental economics is a method, right? I mean,
Hmm.
it has like experimental economics and behavioral economics can exist independently of each other. Experimental economics, of course, by the way, is across. I mean, there are so many types of experiments, right? There's this randomized control trials for which, of course, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee are extremely well known. Um, there's experiments in market design, when people like, for example, guys like Milgram and all have developed these Nobel laureate this time, have developed these kind of auctions and stuff. And if you want to test if these auctions are what economists call incentive compatible, individually rational, efficient, etc. I mean, you can use the lab to test that as well. You can, I mean, theoretically your predictions might show something, but if you really want to know if it works, you can test it in the lab. Uh, you can do field experiments, and like experimental economics is kind of just so important in many ways because it helps in creating a controlled environment, especially lab experiments, and you can hence kind of sort of make your claims with a little more conviction. Having said that, I mean, behavioral economics, just for example, as a theoretical exercise in itself, is quite robust. But it is true that to really know if behavioral economics is, or if a person is behaviorally biased or they are affected by behavioral factors, the best way is an experiment, right? So, for example, if you look at behavioral game theory, right? There are these things called ultimatum games and dictator games. Again, for those who have kind of, studied a few of these things, and you will notice that ultimatum games and dictator games have some predicted sort of, especially if they are, one-time sort of games, that they have some predicted Nash equilibrium, and you would expect the dictator in these games, the person proposing the sort of split, to make a very sort of, to make a very selfish sort of offer. But in reality, people tend to be happy to split goods 50-50, 30-60, etc. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm kind of getting into a little more game theory, but my point is that these things can only be observed in experiments, right? Like these things that we suspect might happen. But maybe the Nash equilibrium would say that, hey, people only care about their payoffs, right? The word payoffs. I mean, people only care about the money they get in their hand from these games. Probably not true. Now the way to check this is experimental economics. By the way, I mean, I would say that one of the big things about experimental economics is because you are controlling the environment, it is actually one type of empirics in which you do not need big data. I mean, you may or may not, but if you are able to substantially control an environment, you can actually do it with limited data. So a lot of experiments you see actually are able to make very strong claims with relatively less number of subjects and trials, etc. Because the whole point is, okay, I'm kind of, I don't have, 10 million data points, but I am very clear about each data point, and I'm kind of sure that the number of confounding variables, etc., are less. So I don't think they intersect that much. I mean, they intersect a lot, as an experimental economics is a very important method for behavioral economics. But I think they kind of both have their role, and are do very well on their own in general. So, you know, and are very
Thank you
important,
so
by the way.
Thank you so much, sir. That was really enlightening. And I'm sure that people who just were fascinated by behavioral economics just because of the Nobel Prize factor associated with it know much more about it after this conversation. And we are really thankful that you agreed to come to our platform
Oh, of
and
course.
give us your valuable time and explain it to us. We are just so glad to have you here. Do you have any few last words for Ecoholics?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I was kind of just looking at the YouTube videos and all. And first of all, I wish when I was in college there were these videos to explain things in a nice and simple way and in a good way, because it's really good. And I mean, economics gets pretty complicated, and it's nice to have a platform online, accessible to people, which can really sort of help them understand things. And another thing I really like is this series you do, speaking to professors and stuff. And I think, probably it's a really nice way to speak about specific topics. Like I saw topics of people speaking about things like game theory and stuff like that. And, it's really nice for someone who teaches it and does research on it to come and talk about it in some detail and to try to explain it to people. And of course, it's really accessible, which I think is wonderful. I really like the series a lot. Saw some nice names over there. It's like some pretty good names. So great stuff. I mean, I wish you all the best of luck moving forward as well.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for agreeing to come to our show and
Of
giving us
course.
your valuable time. I'm sure your insights are going to be of big help to our students. And just thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.